The gymnasium at Camp Pendleton fell silent except for the rhythmic slapping of bare feet against wrestling mats. Lieutenant Jake Morrison stood at the edge of the training area, his Navy SEAL trident gleaming under the fluorescent lights, watching as Master Sergeant Carlos Mendez demonstrated a particularly brutal submission hold to his Marine Corps martial arts program students. The black belt wrapped around Mendez's waist seemed to mock Jake's presence. Here was a SEAL, supposedly among the military's elite, about to enter the domain where these Marines had spent years perfecting their craft. "So this is the hotshot SEAL we've been hearing about," Mendez called out, his voice carrying across the gym as 20 pairs of eyes turned toward Jake. The Master Sergeant's reputation preceded him: 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, and a martial arts instructor's certification that had earned him respect throughout the Marine Corps. His students, all black belts themselves, formed a semicircle around the mats, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. Jake had volunteered for this cross-training exercise, part of a new initiative to foster cooperation between elite units. On paper, it made sense. SEALs and Force Recon Marines often operated in similar environments, and sharing combat techniques could benefit both communities. In reality, Jake was beginning to realize he had walked into a lion's den where his reputation counted for nothing and his skills would be put to the ultimate test. "Welcome to real fighting, sailor," sneered Corporal Tommy Chen, a compact Marine with arms that looked like they belonged on someone twice his size. Chen's black belt was worn and frayed at the edges, a testament to countless hours of training and sparring. "Hope you didn't think this was going to be like your water games." The comment drew chuckles from the other Marines, but Jake remained silent, his jaw set in determination. He had endured worse mockery during BUD/S training, where instructors had pushed him and his classmates beyond what they thought were their breaking points. The difference was that here, he was alone, without the camaraderie of fellow SEAL candidates to share the burden. Mendez stepped forward, his movements fluid and controlled, every step deliberate and calculated. "Here's how this works, Morrison. My boys and I have been studying martial arts for years. This isn't about who can hold their breath underwater the longest or who can carry the heaviest rucksack. This is about pure combat skill, technique perfected through repetition and pain." Jake nodded, understanding the challenge being laid before him. The Marines weren't questioning his courage or dedication; those qualities were assumed among all special operations personnel. They were questioning whether his skills could translate beyond his comfort zone, whether a SEAL could compete in an arena where Marines had spent years establishing their dominance. The first opponent stepped forward, Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, whose scarred knuckles told the story of countless sparring sessions and real-world encounters. Rodriguez had earned his black belt the hard way, through years of grinding practice and competitive tournaments where second place meant going home empty-handed. "Let's see what you've got, Frogman," Rodriguez said, dropping into a fighting stance that spoke of muscle memory developed over thousands of hours of training. The match began with Rodriguez testing Jake's defenses, throwing quick jabs and kicks designed to gauge reaction time and technique. Jake found himself giving ground, his movements reactive rather than proactive. The months of specialized SEAL training had focused on weapons handling, small unit tactics, and maritime operations, not the kind of hand-to-hand combat these Marines had turned into an art form. Rodriguez pressed his advantage, catching Jake with a solid right cross that sent stars dancing across his vision. The Marines watching from the sidelines erupted in approval, their voices echoing off the gym walls as their teammate demonstrated what they saw as the superiority of their training methods. "Come on, SEAL," Chen called out. "I thought you guys were supposed to be tough." Jake tasted blood but refused to back down. He had not survived the crucible of SEAL training to be defeated by embarrassment. Rodriguez came forward again, confident now, perhaps overconfident. Jake waited for the opening, using the patience that had been drilled into him during countless hours of sniper training and surveillance operations. When Rodriguez threw a heavy haymaker, Jake slipped under it and drove his shoulder into the Marine's midsection, using leverage and timing rather than brute strength. Rodriguez went down hard, the air rushing from his lungs as he hit the mat. For a moment, the gym fell silent. "Lucky shot," Mendez observed, but there was a note of interest in his voice now. "Chen, you're up." Chen approached with more caution than his predecessor, his movements crisp and economical. He had been watching Jake's technique, noting the SEAL's tendency to rely on unexpected angles and timing rather than conventional martial arts combinations. The second fight lasted longer, both men testing each other's limits. Chen's black belt training showed in his textbook form and technique, but Jake began to find a rhythm, using unconventional tactics that drew on his diverse training background. When Chen attempted a traditional throw, Jake countered with a move that borrowed elements from his combat swimmer training, using the Marine's momentum against him. As Chen hit the mat, Jake heard something unexpected: silence. The Marines were no longer laughing or calling out encouragements to their teammates. They were studying him, recognizing that they were witnessing something they hadn't expected. Fight after fight, Jake found himself adapting, learning, growing stronger as the Marines tested every aspect of his combat skills. Some fights he won, others he lost, but, with each encounter, he was building something new, a fighting style that combined his SEAL training with hard-earned lessons from these Marine instructors. By the time he faced Mendez himself, Jake was operating on pure adrenaline and determination. The Master Sergeant was in a different class from his students, his movements flowing like water, his techniques perfected through years of competition and combat application. Mendez dominated the early portions of their fight, using his superior technique and experience to control the pace and distance. Jake found himself trapped in submission holds, forced to tap out repeatedly as the Marine demonstrated the effectiveness of ground fighting against an opponent who hadn't spent years developing those specific skills. But Jake didn't quit. Each time Mendez submitted him, Jake returned to his feet, adjusted his approach, and engaged again. He began to understand that this wasn't just about winning or losing individual fights, it was about proving that he could absorb punishment, learn from failure, and continue fighting regardless of the circumstances. As the training session stretched into its third hour, something fundamental began to change. The Marines who had started the day mocking Jake's presence were now offering advice, pointing out technical details that might help him improve his performance. Chen, whom Jake had defeated earlier, was demonstrating proper footwork during ground transitions. "You've got heart, SEAL," Rodriguez admitted as Jake prepared to face another opponent. "I'll give you that." The transformation wasn't instantaneous or complete. Jake continued to lose more fights than he won, but the nature of those losses changed. He was no longer being overwhelmed by superior technique, he was losing competitive battles between skilled opponents who respected each other's abilities. When the session finally ended, Jake's uniform was soaked with sweat and spotted with blood from a dozen minor cuts and scrapes. His body ached in places he had forgotten existed, and his ego bore the bruises of multiple defeats. But something profound had occurred in that gymnasium, something that went beyond winning or losing individual fights. Mendez approached as Jake was gathering his gear, the Master Sergeant's expression thoughtful. "I misjudged you, Morrison. When I heard we were getting a SEAL for cross-training, I figured it would be another prima donna who thought his reputation was enough to carry him through anything." Jake looked up from tying his boots, meeting Mendez's gaze directly. "I thought I could walk in here and hold my own based on my SEAL training alone." "I was wrong." "No," Mendez shook his head. "You were right about one thing, you could hold your own. Just not the way you expected to." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Real strength isn't about never getting knocked down. It's about getting back up every time, learning from the beating, and coming back stronger." The conversation was interrupted by Chen, who had been watching from across the gym. "Hey, Morrison," the Marine called out. "We train here 3 times a week. You're welcome to join us if you're interested in actually learning something." Jake nodded, understanding that the invitation represented more than just additional training opportunities. It was acceptance into a brotherhood that valued skill, determination, and the willingness to push beyond comfortable limitations. Over the following weeks, Jake returned to the Marine gym regularly, each session building on the lessons learned during his humbling introduction to their training methods. The Marines who had once mocked his presence now treated him as a legitimate training partner, someone whose unique background brought valuable perspectives to their practice sessions. The transformation wasn't limited to Jake's fighting skills. He began to understand that true strength came from acknowledging weakness and working systematically to address it. Every submission hold that trapped him became a lesson in human anatomy and leverage. Every successful counterattack he managed became a building block for more complex techniques. Rodriguez became an unofficial mentor, staying after formal training sessions to work on specific techniques with Jake. The thing about martial arts, Rodriguez explained one evening as they practiced ground fighting, is that it's not really about fighting at all. It's about understanding yourself, your limitations, your fears, your automatic responses under stress. Jake found himself applying these lessons beyond the training mats. His approach to SEAL operations became more thoughtful and systematic. Where he had once relied primarily on physical conditioning and basic techniques, he now incorporated the kind of technical precision and tactical thinking that characterized the Marines' approach to combat. The breakthrough came during a joint training exercise 6 months after Jake's introduction to the Marine training program. A simulated hostage rescue scenario required both SEAL and Marine units to work together, combining maritime infiltration with close-quarters combat in an urban environment. Jake found himself leading a mixed team of SEALs and Marines through the final assault phase, where his improved hand-to-hand combat skills proved crucial in neutralizing role-playing opponents without alerting nearby hostiles. The techniques he had learned during months of hard training with the Marines seamlessly integrated with his SEAL tactical training, creating a more complete and effective operator. Chen, now a close friend and training partner, was part of the joint team. As they cleared the final room, Chen found himself in trouble, trapped by 2 opponents who had gotten inside his rifle's effective range. Jake moved without thinking, using a combination he had developed through countless hours of practice, part SEAL combat technique, part Marine martial arts. The 2 opponents went down quickly and, quietly, eliminated without raising an alarm that might have compromised the mission. Chen looked at Jake with something approaching awe. "That was beautiful, man. Where did that come from?" Jake helped Chen to his feet, both men checking their equipment as they prepared to move to the extraction point. "It came from getting my ass kicked by you guys for 6 months straight," Jake replied with a grin. "Best education I ever received." The mission was deemed a complete success, with commanders from both units noting the exceptional level of cooperation and effectiveness displayed by the joint team. But, for Jake, the real victory had occurred months earlier, in that first humbling training session where he had learned the difference between reputation and capability. Mendez approached Jake during the after-action review, his expression serious but proud. "I've been thinking about what you said that first day, about thinking your SEAL training was enough to carry you through anything." Jake nodded, remembering the arrogance he had felt walking into that first training session. "I was pretty naive." "No," Mendez corrected him. "You were partially right. Your SEAL training was enough to give you the mental toughness to absorb the beating we gave you and come back for more. But it was only enough if you were willing to admit what you didn't know and do the work to learn it." The Master Sergeant paused, looking out at the Marines and SEALs who were cleaning weapons and equipment after the exercise. "Most people can't do that. They get their credentials, their reputation, their sense of identity tied up in being the best at something. When they encounter evidence that they're not the best, they either make excuses or avoid the challenge altogether." Jake understood what Mendez was getting at. The military was full of personnel who had achieved a certain level of expertise and, then, stopped growing, content to rest on their past accomplishments rather than continuing to push their boundaries. "The thing is," Mendez continued, "the moment you stop growing, you start dying. Skills deteriorate, confidence becomes arrogance, and, eventually, someone younger and hungrier comes along to replace you." This observation resonated deeply with Jake. He had seen it happen to senior operators who became too comfortable with their reputations, who stopped training as hard or pushing themselves as relentlessly. They often became casualties not in combat, but in the slower process of professional obsolescence. "So what's the solution?" Jake asked. Mendez smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern features. "You already found it. Destroy the part of yourself that thinks you've learned enough, that thinks you're good enough, that thinks your reputation should protect you from having to prove yourself again and again." Jake thought about his journey from that first humiliating day to the successful joint operation they had just completed. It hadn't been a linear progression, there had been setbacks, frustrations, moments when he had questioned whether the effort was worth the pain and embarrassment. But each setback had taught him something valuable, not just about fighting techniques but about the nature of growth itself. He had learned that true strength came from vulnerability, that the willingness to be vulnerable, to admit ignorance, to risk failure, to endure temporary defeat, was what separated those who continued to grow from those who stagnated. Chen joined their conversation, still energized from the successful mission. "You know what I realized today," he said, addressing both men. 6 months ago, I thought Morrison was just another arrogant SEAL who needed to be taught some humility. But, watching him today, seeing how he's integrated everything we've taught him with his own background, that's not just humility. That's wisdom." Jake felt a surge of pride, but it was different from the ego-driven satisfaction he had once derived from his SEAL reputation. This pride was earned through honest effort and genuine growth, not granted by an institution or inherited from past accomplishments. Rodriguez appeared, overhearing the tail end of their conversation. "The funny thing is, Morrison, you've made all of us better too. Some of the techniques you've brought from your SEAL training have really improved our small unit tactics. And, watching you learn our stuff has reminded us why we started training in the first place." This insight surprised Jake. He had been so focused on his own learning process that he hadn't fully appreciated the reciprocal nature of the relationship he had developed with the Marines. They had taught him their martial arts techniques, but he had shared insights from his maritime operations background that enhanced their tactical capabilities. "I guess that's what real training partnerships look like," Jake observed. "Everyone grows, everyone learns something new." Mendez nodded approvingly. "That's the difference between training and education. Training teaches you to do specific things in specific ways. Education teaches you to think, to adapt, to integrate new information with existing knowledge." As the group prepared to leave the training facility, Jake reflected on the profound changes that had occurred not just in his fighting skills but in his entire approach to professional development. He had learned to embrace discomfort as a teacher, to view failure as information rather than judgment, and to measure success by growth rather than victories. The Marines who had once mocked his presence now considered him a valued training partner and friend. But, more importantly, Jake had learned to separate his sense of worth from his performance in any single endeavor. He was still a SEAL, still proud of his service and accomplishments, but those achievements no longer defined the limits of his potential. 2 years after that first humbling day in the Marine gym, Jake found himself in a very different position. He had been selected to develop a new cross-training curriculum that would be implemented throughout special operations units, incorporating lessons learned from his experience with the Marines and other elite units. The assignment was both an honor and a responsibility. Jake understood that his credibility came not from his original SEAL credentials, but from his demonstrated willingness to learn from others and integrate diverse skill sets into a coherent whole. His first stop was Fort Bragg, where he met with Special Forces trainers who specialized in unconventional warfare techniques. The Green Berets had their own martial arts traditions, heavily influenced by training received from indigenous fighters in various theaters of operation. "So you're the SEAL who thinks Marines can teach," joked Master Sergeant David Kim, a Special Forces hand-to-hand combat instructor whose office walls were covered with certificates from martial arts schools in Thailand, Brazil, and the Philippines. "I heard you've been getting your ass kicked for the last couple of years." Jake laughed, recognizing the good-natured ribbing that characterized relationships between special operations units. "Best education I ever received. I'm here to see what you guys can teach me about getting my ass kicked in new and interesting ways." Kim's expression shifted to one of respect. "That's the right attitude. Most people who come through here are trying to prove how tough they are. You're here to learn how to get tougher." The Special Forces' approach to hand-to-hand combat was different from both SEAL and Marine techniques. Where SEALs focused on quick, efficient neutralization of threats, and Marines emphasized technical precision and competitive application, the Green Berets had developed systems based on survival in environments where conventional weapons might not be available. "Our guys spend months embedded with local forces who may not have access to modern weapons," Kim explained as he demonstrated a fighting technique that incorporated improvised weapons and environmental advantages. "They need to be able to fight effectively with whatever's available: rocks, sticks, broken bottles, whatever." Jake spent weeks at Fort Bragg, absorbing not just fighting techniques but the philosophical approach that underlied Special Forces training. The Green Berets had learned to adapt to any environment, to find strength and flexibility rather than rigid adherence to doctrine. The thing about being a student, Kim observed during one particularly grueling training session, is that you never stop being a student. The moment you think you've graduated, you stop learning, and the world moves past you. This insight resonated with lessons Jake had learned from his Marine training partners. The most skilled fighters he had encountered all shared a common characteristic: they approached each training session as if they were beginners, open to new information and willing to question their assumptions. From Fort Bragg, Jake traveled to Coronado, where he worked with Navy SEAL instructors to document the maritime combat techniques that had been developed through decades of operational experience. Here, he found himself in the unusual position of being both student and teacher, learning advanced techniques from instructors while sharing insights gained from his cross-training experiences. "You've changed," observed Senior Chief Petty Officer Mark Stevens, one of Jake's former BUD/S instructors. 2 years ago, you were a good operator, but you fought like you had something to prove. Now you fight like you have something to protect." Stevens' observation captured something important about Jake's evolution. His initial approach to combat had been driven by ego and the need to demonstrate his capabilities. Now, his fighting skills were integrated into a broader understanding of protection, protecting teammates, protecting missions, protecting the values he served. "I learned that trying to prove you're the best is a losing game," Jake replied. "There's always someone younger, stronger, or more skilled. But becoming the best version of yourself, that's a game you can win every day." The curriculum Jake developed drew on techniques and philosophies from all the units he had trained with, but it was more than just a compilation of fighting moves. It was a framework for continuous learning that emphasized adaptability, humility, and the integration of diverse skill sets. The first pilot program was conducted at Camp Pendleton, bringing together operators from SEALs, Marines, Special Forces, and Air Force Special Operations. Jake stood before the assembled group, remembering his own first day in the Marine gym and the journey that had brought him to this point. "We're going to start with an assumption," Jake announced to the mixed group of elite operators. "The assumption is that every person in this room has something to teach and something to learn. Your rank, your unit affiliation, your combat experience, none of that matters for the next 2 weeks. What matters is your willingness to be vulnerable enough to grow." The program was structured as a series of teaching rotations, with each operator taking turns as both student and instructor. SEALs taught maritime combat techniques, Marines demonstrated ground fighting, Special Forces shared unconventional weapons training, and Air Force operators showed how to fight in restricted spaces like aircraft. But the real learning occurred in the spaces between formal instruction, when operators from different units worked together to solve tactical problems that required integration of multiple skill sets. Jake watched with satisfaction as an Air Force operator and a Marine worked together to develop a new technique for close-quarters combat in confined spaces, combining the Air Force operator's experience with aircraft security and the Marines' ground fighting expertise. "This is what I was hoping to see," Jake told Stevens during one of their evening debriefings. "They're not just learning techniques, they're learning to learn from each other." The success of the pilot program led to its expansion throughout special operations units, with Jake serving as the primary architect of what became known as the Integrated Combat Skills Program. But, for Jake, the real measure of success wasn't institutional adoption, it was the transformation he witnessed in individual operators who learned to separate their sense of worth from their performance in any single area of expertise. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, a Marine pilot who had participated in the program, captured the essence of what Jake had been trying to achieve. "I came into this program thinking I needed to prove I could fight as well as the ground combat guys," she told Jake during the final assessment. "I learned instead that my value comes from integrating my aviation background with hand-to-hand skills to create something new." Martinez had developed techniques specifically designed for aircrew who might find themselves in ground combat situations, combining her understanding of aviation systems with the martial arts skills she learned during the program. Her innovations were subsequently incorporated into aircrew survival training, potentially saving lives in future downed aircraft scenarios. The ripple effects of Jake's curriculum extended beyond the special operations community. Regular military units began requesting modified versions of the program, and civilian law enforcement agencies expressed interest in the cross-training methodology. But, perhaps the most significant impact was on Jake himself. He had begun his journey as a competent SEAL operator who thought his training was complete. Through the painful process of acknowledging his limitations and working systematically to address them, he had become something more valuable, an educator who could help others navigate their own growth journeys. Standing in the same gymnasium where his transformation had begun, Jake watched a new group of operators go through their first cross-training session. A young SEAL was getting submitted repeatedly by a Marine corporal, his frustration evident in the tension of his shoulders and the set of his jaw. Jake approached during a break, recognizing the mix of anger and embarrassment he had felt during his own first session. "Tough day?" The young SEAL, Lieutenant Kevin Park, nodded without looking up. "I don't understand it. I've been through BUD/S, I've completed multiple deployments, I can outswim and outrun any of these Marines. But put me on a wrestling mat and I'm useless." Jake sat down beside Park, remembering his own confusion and frustration from that first day. "Let me tell you something I wish someone had told me when I was in your position. This isn't about swimming or running or shooting. This is about something much more important." Park looked up, curiosity overriding his embarrassment. "What's that?" "It's about learning to be comfortable being uncomfortable. It's about understanding that your worth as an operator isn't determined by your ability to dominate in every single area of expertise." Jake paused, choosing his words carefully. "The strongest people aren't those who never lose, they're the ones who lose, learn, and come back stronger." Over the following hours, Jake watched Park's approach change. Instead of trying to muscle his way through techniques, the young SEAL began asking questions, observing more carefully, accepting instruction with humility rather than resentment. By the end of the day, Park wasn't winning his matches, but he was learning. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that learning was the real victory. As the training session concluded, Mendez approached Jake, the Master Sergeant's presence still commanding despite the gray now visible in his hair. "You know what I find interesting?" Mendez asked, watching Park work on technique with one of the Marine instructors. "What's that?" "That kid reminds me of you 2 years ago, frustrated, angry, confused about why his previous training wasn't enough." Mendez smiled. "But he's learning the same lesson you learned. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others." Jake nodded, understanding the profound truth in Mendez's observation. The weak self that had to be destroyed wasn't weakness in the conventional sense, it was the ego-driven need to always appear strong, the fear of vulnerability that prevented growth, the attachment to past accomplishments that limited future potential. "I think that's what real strength looks like," Jake replied. "Not the absence of weakness, but the courage to face it, learn from it, and use it as fuel for growth." As the sun set over Camp Pendleton, casting long shadows across the training facility, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him from arrogant newcomer to respected educator. The path had required him to surrender his need to always be the best, to embrace vulnerability as a teacher, and to find strength in the continuous process of becoming rather than the static state of being. The Marines who had once mocked his presence were now colleagues and friends, partners in a shared understanding that true warriors were not those who never faced defeat, but those who faced it repeatedly and emerged stronger each time. The young SEAL who had started the day frustrated and confused was now asking intelligent questions and accepting instruction with grace. In him, Jake saw the continuation of a cycle that would transform not just individual operators, but the entire culture of elite military units. The man who destroys his weak self, Jake had learned, doesn't destroy it once and move on. He destroys it daily, in each moment when pride must be set aside for learning, when comfort must be abandoned for growth, when the easy path must be rejected in favor of the difficult but transformative journey of continuous improvement. In that gymnasium where he had once been humbled by Marine black belts, Jake had discovered a truth more valuable than any technique or tactic: the strongest person is not the one who never gets knocked down, but the one who gets back up every time, learns from the experience, and returns to the fight with new wisdom and deeper strength. The mocking had stopped long ago, replaced by mutual respect and genuine partnership. But the learning never stopped, and neither did the growing. That, Jake realized, was exactly as it should be.